So why might shooting someone on purpose, absolutely not be murder?
Right. It sounds crazy.
It really does. And on the
Okay.
flip side, why might accidentally dropping a bowling ball get you a first-degree murder charge?
Yeah, that one always throws people off.
Well, if you are sitting for the multi-state bar examination, the MBE, picking the wrong answer to those exact questions could literally cost you your law license.
It absolutely could.
So we're going to map out exactly why those weird kind of counterintuitive outcomes happen. Welcome to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here. You know, when you frame it like that, it sounds like a series of trick questions.
Yeah, a little bit.
But criminal law actually has a very strict internal logic. The difficulty is just that this logic takes a little while to get used to.
Especially on the exam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The exam writers, they deliberately design these scenarios to make your normal human sense of fairness completely clash with the rigid rules of the common law.
Right, and that is actually the perfect way to frame our mission for this deep dive.
I-
Because we are speaking directly to you, the listener, who is tackling an incredibly specific challenge right now. You are preparing for the MBE, and crucially, you're doing it as an English, as a second language speaker.
Which is just a monumental task. I mean, the law is already a foreign language to native speakers.
Oh, completely. It's stuffed with old Latin phrases, outdated British common law terms, and sentences that seem to run on for pages.
Right. So when you're learning complex legal rules in a second language, translating those dense words in your head during a timed exam, well, it simply takes too much mental energy.
You just don't have the time for it.
No, you don't. You can't afford to be translating vocabulary while also trying to solve a tricky legal puzzle. You need pictures.
Yes, pictures.
You need a mental structure that bypasses all that dense jargon.
So we are going to build a visualization tool together today. I want you to close your eyes, well, unless you're driving or walking down the street, obviously.
Yeah, please keep your eyes open if you're driving.
Definitely. But if you can, imagine a giant blank whiteboard in your mind. It's totally clean, stretching out right in front of you. This is your mental mind map.
I love this strategy.
Right in the very center of this bright whiteboard, I want you to draw a big, thick circle. And inside that circle, write the word homicide.
Perfect. And throughout our discussion today, we are going to draw distinct branches reaching out from that center circle.
Like a tree.
Exactly. We'll populate those branches with simple, everyday English translations of the law. By the time we finish, you will have a complete visual map of every major rule you need to know about killing another person under the law.
Ready to be recalled the moment you sit down for the exam.
That's the goal.
So if the center of our map is that big circle, we need to know what actually goes inside it. Like, what's the foundational definition of homicide?
In the absolute simplest terms, a homicide is just the killing of a living human being by another human being.
Just that simple.
That's the starting point for every single scenario on the exam.
Okay. And according to the source material, the common law basically splits homicide into 3 distinct categories.
Right, 3 buckets.
There's justified homicide, which means the killing was legal and even encouraged by society, like a police officer using deadly force to stop an active shooter.
Exactly.
Then there's excusable homicide, which is a pure, unavoidable accident where no one is legally at fault. And finally, there's criminal homicide.
And for the purposes of the MBE, criminal homicide is where you will spend all of your mental energy.
Because they don't test you on people behaving perfectly.
Right. They test you on crimes. So criminal homicide is divided into 3 main offenses: murder, voluntary manslaughter, and involuntary manslaughter.
Got it. But before we divide homicide into those 3 specific crimes, there is a fundamental rule that governs the entire center circle of our mind map.
The living person rule.
Yes, our source text highlights this rule. It states, very simply, a person cannot be killed twice.
It sounds a bit like a dark joke, honestly.
It really does.
But it is a highly tested concept. The law strictly requires a living victim at the exact moment the defendant takes action. You literally cannot commit a homicide against someone who has already passed away.
Okay, I want to make sure I am visualizing this correctly. Let's say an assassin sneaks into a morgue, right? They think a body under a sheet is actually a sleeping witness.
Okay, classic exam scenario.
The assassin shoots the corpse. They cannot be charged with homicide, even though they totally thought they were committing a murder.
That is correct. They might be guilty of a different crime, like maybe abuse of a corpse or destruction of property, but absolutely not criminal homicide.
Wow.
We have to look at the underlying philosophy of why the law requires a living person. The law of homicide is designed to punish the physical act of taking away a life that is currently in progress.
Right.
If the life has already ended, the specific crime of homicide is impossible to commit. The physical reality just overrides the defendant's imagination.
I actually like to think of it using a simple, non-legal analogy. Imagine you want to break a glass cup. You pick up a heavy hammer and swing it down. You broke the cup.
Makes sense.
But what if you walk into the kitchen and that glass cup is already shattered into 100 tiny pieces on the floor? You can take your hammer and smash those pieces all day long.
Right, you can have the absolute desire to break it.
Exactly. But you cannot actually break it. It is already broken. You cannot take a life that has already departed.
That visual of the broken cup perfectly captures the physical impossibility of the crime. And while we're defining this rule inside our center circle, we should probably add one more historical detail.
Oh, right. The fetus rule.
Yes. Under the traditional common law, which is the default rule set for the MBE, unless a modern statute is mentioned, a fetus is not considered a living person.
That feels like a trap just waiting to happen on the exam. Why did the common law exclude a fetus from the definition of a living human being?
It really just comes down to the limitations of historical medical science. Hundreds of years ago, when these rules were being created by judges in England, medical technology couldn't reliably prove whether a fetus was alive in the room.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they couldn't tell if an injury to the mother caused a miscarriage versus just a natural complication. So, to avoid guessing, the common law created a strict rule. The child had to be born alive and take a breath independent of the mother to be considered a living person.
That makes the historical context much clearer. It was an issue of proof, not really just philosophy.
Exactly.
But I have a hypothetical that challenges this living person rule. Let's say we change the facts a little bit.
Yeah.
A person sneaks into a bedroom with a knife. They see their sworn enemy lying in bed.
Okay.
The attacker has total malicious intention. They want to commit a brutal murder. They stab the person in the bed repeatedly. But turns out, the person in the bed had suffered a massive fatal heart attack an hour earlier.
Ah, another classic twist.
Right. Doesn't the attacker's evil intention count for something? I mean, the attacker is clearly a dangerous person.
Intention absolutely counts, but it changes the name of the crime entirely. This is exactly how the MBE loves to trap test takers. In your scenario, the attacker cannot possibly be guilty of murder because the victim was not a living human being at the moment the knife struck.
The cup was already broken.
Exactly. However, the law doesn't want dangerous people to just escape punishment because they got incredibly lucky. Because the attacker had the specific intent to kill and they took a major physical step toward completing that goal, they will be charged with attempted murder.
Okay, so the system still captures the bad behavior, but it puts it under the category of an attempt rather than a completed homicide.
That is the vital distinction. So on our mental whiteboard, inside that center circle that says homicide, you should visualize our first rule. Must be a living human.
Awesome. So now that the center is firmly established, we know what a homicide is. But how does a prosecutor legally connect a dead body to the person sitting at the defense table?
Right, there has to be a link.
Yeah, a physical and logical link.
Yeah.
So this is where we draw our first big branch out from the center circle. Imagine drawing a thick line up and to the right and label this branch causation.
Causation is the bridge between the defendant's bad act and the victim's death. To win a homicide case, the prosecution can't just show that the defendant did something bad and the victim died. They must prove that the defendant's specific actions caused the death.
And according to the foundational rules, this requires a strict two-part test.
Yes, two distinct steps.
It's not enough to just point a finger. The sources dictate that step one is proving actual cause, which the text also refers to as cause in fact.
Correct.
And step two is proving proximate cause, which is also known as legal cause. The materials are very clear. You need both steps. If a prosecutor fails to prove even one, the whole charge collapses.
It completely falls apart.
Let's tackle step one first. Actual cause. The legal terminology here is the but-for test. Could you translate but-for into conversational English for our listener?
Sure. The but-for test is essentially a hypothetical question that the jury has to ask themselves. They look at the evidence and ask, but for the defendant's action, would the victim have died when they did?
So an alternate reality.
Exactly. An even simpler way to phrase it is to imagine a parallel universe. If you can imagine a universe where the defendant simply stayed home in bed and did absolutely nothing, would the victim still be alive today? If the answer is yes, then the defendant is the actual cause of the death.
Okay, so if I stay in bed, The victim continues walking down the street unharmed. Therefore, my action of getting out of bed and hitting them with my car is the actual cause. The logic is pretty straightforward.
It is, until the bar examiners get involved.
Right. They're going to test the boundaries of this logic.
They absolutely will. And the first major boundary they test is an exception to the but-for test called the substantial factor rule.
Okay, substantial factor.
This rule kicks in when there are multiple forces causing a death at the exact same time.
The source text provides a really fascinating example of this. Let's visualize two completely independent individuals, shooter A and shooter B. They do not know each other.
Right, no conspiracy.
No plan at all. But by pure coincidence, they both raise their guns and shoot a third person, the victim, at the exact same fraction of a second. Both bullets strike the victim directly in the heart. The medical examiner testifies that either bullet, all by itself, would have caused instant death.
This scenario exposes a really bizarre loophole if we strictly rely on the but-for test.
How so?
Imagine shooter A sitting in the courtroom. Shooter A's lawyer argues, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let's use the parallel universe test. If my client, shooter A, had stayed home in bed, the victim still would have died at that exact moment because shooter B's bullet hit him."
Wow. And shooter B's lawyer would stand up and use the exact same logic.
Exactly. If my client, shooter B, had stayed home, the victim still dies because of shooter A.
So if the jury follows the strict but-for logic, they would have to conclude that neither shooter was the actual cause of death.
Which would result in both killers escaping punishment without any criminal charges for the homicide.
That's wild.
The law simply will not tolerate an outcome where two murderers go free just because of a mathematical coincidence. So to close this loophole, the courts created the substantial factor test.
Okay, what does that test say?
The rule states that if a defendant's action was a major substantial part of bringing about the death, they are considered the actual cause, even if another force was also a substantial factor. In the case of the two independent shooters, both bullets were substantial factors in destroying the heart. Therefore, they are both the actual cause. They both face murder charges.
That makes perfect sense as a matter of public policy. You can't just point your finger at a simultaneous event to wash your hands of a murder.
Right.
Let's explore another nuance under actual cause. The source text brings up a concept called the eggshell victim rule. What happens when the victim has a hidden medical condition?
Oh, the eggshell victim rule, sometimes called the eggshell skull rule, is a favorite for the bar examiners because it feels slightly unfair to the defendant.
How so?
Well, the legal maxim is, you take your victim exactly as you find them. This means if you choose to assault someone, you assume all the risks of their hidden physical vulnerabilities.
Let me try to synthesize this with a hypothetical to make sure I'm not falling into an exam trap. I get into a minor argument with someone at a coffee shop. I lose my temper and punch them in the shoulder. It's a very weak punch. For 99% of the human population, this punch would result in nothing more than a tiny bruise. But unbeknownst to me, this specific victim suffers from a severe, incredibly rare heart condition. The sudden surprise and shock of the minor punch triggers a massive, fatal heart attack. The victim dies on the floor. I want to argue in court, this is absurd. A normal, healthy person wouldn't have even lost their balance, let alone died.
And your argument about a normal, healthy person is completely irrelevant under the law.
Really, completely irrelevant.
Completely. The law says you chose to commit an unlawful battery. By doing so, you assume the risk that the person you hit might be fragile. Your punch was the actual physical catalyst that triggered the heart attack.
So back to the parallel universe test.
Exactly. If you had stayed home, they wouldn't have suffered the shock, and they wouldn't have died that day. Your action is the actual cause of death. The victim's pre-existing hidden frailty does not erase your legal responsibility for starting the chain reaction.
The lesson there is just keep your hands to yourself because you literally never know what is happening inside someone else's body.
Good life advice and good legal advice.
Let's look at one final scenario under Step 1, actual cause. This one deals with the concept of mercy killings, which brings up a lot of moral complexity.
It does.
Suppose a person is suffering from a painful terminal illness. The doctors say they have only a few days left to live and the pain is unbearable. The sick person begs their closest friend, "Please, I'm begging you to end my suffering." The friend, motivated entirely by love and compassion, agrees. The friend prepares a syringe with a fatal dose of medication and injects the sick person, ending their life peacefully. The victim gave full, enthusiastic consent.
On an emotional and moral level, many people can deeply sympathize with the friend's actions. But the MBE does not test your personal morals, it tests the rigid framework of the common law. And legally, consent is never a valid defense to criminal homicide.
Never.
Never. The legal philosophy is that human life doesn't just belong to the individual, it belongs to the state and to society as a whole. An individual simply does not have the legal authority to consent to their own murder.
So the friend who physically pushed the plunger on the syringe is the actual cause of death, regardless of the compassionate motive. They performed the physical act that ended a life.
Yes, that is the harsh reality of the common law.
But our sources make a very careful distinction regarding the method here. What if the friend does not inject the medicine? What if the friend simply places a bottle of fatal pills on the nightstand, says goodbye, and walks out of the room? An hour later, the sick person reaches over, opens the bottle, and swallows the pills themselves.
That small change in facts completely alters the criminal charge. By swallowing the pills, the sick person took the final fatal action. The law considers that act to be suicide, and suicide is legally distinct from homicide.
I see.
Therefore, the friend who provided the pills did not commit criminal homicide. They did not cause the death in the strict legal sense. They would likely be charged with a different, lesser offense, typically known as assisting a suicide, but they escaped the label of murderer because they did not strike the final blow.
The identity of the person who performs the final physical act is the dividing line. Okay, that covers step one of the causation branch. We've established how to prove the defendant's action was the physical trigger, but causation has two steps. Even if you are the actual cause, the prosecutor must also prove step two, proximate cause. Why do we need a second step?
Proximate cause basically acts as a safety valve for the legal system. It asks a fundamental question of fairness. Even though we know the defendant's action physically started the chain of events, is it legally fair to hold them responsible for the final result?
Fairness, okay.
Yeah, sometimes the chain of events becomes so bizarre, so convoluted, or so unpredictable that society just decides it would be unjust to label the defendant a murderer.
The magic word that always appears in the source material alongside proximate cause is foreseeability. The jury has to ask if the death was a natural and probable result of the defendant's initial bad act.
Foreseeability is exactly the standard. Was the ultimate outcome something that a reasonable person could have predicted when they took the first dangerous action?
I find that visual analogies work best for this.
Yeah.
I picture proximate cause like a long, elaborate line of dominoes set up on the floor.
Okay, I like them.
You, the defendant, walk up and push the very first domino. That push represents actual cause. You undeniably started the chain reaction. Proximate cause asks the jury to watch the dominoes fall. Did the dominoes fall in a normal, predictable sequence until the final domino tipped over? Or, halfway through the sequence, did a stray dog run into the room, slip on a rug, and crash into the remaining dominoes, knocking them over in a chaotic mess?
That is an excellent visual framework. If the dominoes fall in a natural, unbroken line, the defendant remains the proximate cause. If the imaginary dog crashes into the sequence, the law calls that an unforeseeable intervening act.
So the dog breaks the chain.
Exactly. The dog breaks the chain of legal responsibility. The defendant started the sequence, but the unpredictable dog finished it. Therefore, the defendant is not legally responsible for the final fallen domino.
Let's translate this domino analogy into real-world legal scenarios that might actually appear on the exam. What are some intervening acts that the law considers normal? Things that do not break the chain of responsibility.
A classic, highly tested example is medical malpractice.
Oh, really? Yeah. Imagine you shoot someone in the chest. An ambulance arrives and rushes the victim to the emergency room. During surgery, the trauma doctor is exhausted and makes a terrible, negligent mistake, accidentally severing an artery, which causes the victim to bleed to death.
Oof.
As the shooter, you might try to argue, I didn't kill him. The doctor's mistake killed him. The doctor is the dog crashing into the dominoes.
But the law does not view the doctor as an unforeseeable event, does it?
No, it does not. The legal reasoning is that if you shoot someone with a deadly weapon, it is entirely foreseeable. In fact, it is practically guaranteed that they will require emergency medical treatment. And unfortunately, human error in medical treatment is considered a natural and probable risk of putting someone in the hospital.
That makes sense, sad as it is.
The doctor's mistake is considered a normal part of the falling dominoes. You, the shooter, are still the proximate cause of the death, and you will be charged with homicide. That is a harsh rule, but it forces the person who created the initial danger to own the consequences. What about a situation involving suicide? The source text notes that if a victim commits suicide specifically to escape the agonizing pain of the injuries you inflicted, you remain responsible for their death.
Yes, the law recognizes that inflicting severe, excruciating physical trauma can drive a human being to take irrational, desperate actions to escape the agony. The suicide is viewed as a direct, foreseeable extension of the extreme pain you caused. The chain of responsibility remains completely intact.
If medical mistakes and desperate suicides do not break the chain, what actually does? What represents the dog slipping on the rug in a legal fact pattern?
It has to be an event that is completely abnormal, extraordinary, or what people commonly refer to as an act of nature. The most famous law school example involves a lightning strike.
Lightning.
You're right. Yes. You assault a victim, breaking their leg. They are placed in an ambulance to go to the hospital. While the ambulance is driving down the highway, a freak thunderstorm rolls in and a bolt of lightning strikes the ambulance directly, killing the victim instantly.
That is the literal definition of unpredictable.
Precisely. You are the actual cause using our parallel universe test. If you had not broken their leg, they would not have been in that specific ambulance at that specific moment, and they would have survived the storm.
Wow.
But you are not the proximate cause. A lightning strike is a bizarre freak occurrence. It is not a natural or probable result of a broken leg. It would offend our sense of justice to label you a murderer because the weather changed, the chain is broken, you would be charged with assault for the broken leg, but absolutely not homicide.
This dual requirement of actual and proximate cause brings a lot of clarity to these messy situations. Before we finish drawing the causation branch, there's a massive MBE exam note highlighted in our sources regarding the concept of accelerating a death.
Ah, yes. This is a scenario designed to test your strict adherence to the rules over your emotional reaction. Imagine a patient in a hospital who is suffering from a terminal disease. The medical monitors are beeping, and the attending physician declares that the patient has exactly 5 minutes left to live.
Okay, 5 minutes.
A jealous relative walks into the hospital room, pulls out a suppressed pistol, and shoots the patient in the head, killing them instantly. When the relative is arrested, they argue, "You can't charge me with murder. I didn't steal their life. Nature had already claimed it. They were going to die in 300 seconds anyway."
It sounds like a clever philosophical argument, but how does the rigid logic of the law actually handle it?
The law rejects the argument entirely. The foundational rule is that making a person die even 1 minute sooner than they naturally would have is legally causing their death. The legal term is accelerating the death.
Every human being on Earth is eventually going to die. We all have a ticking clock. Murder, in the eyes of the law, is simply the act of unlawfully speeding up that clock.
Exactly. Whether you accelerate a victim's death by 50 years or you accelerate it by 50 seconds, the legal result is identical. You took away time that belonged to the victim. You are the legal cause of the death.
Okay, let's pause and review our mental whiteboard. In the center, we have the circle labeled homicide, with the rule, must be a living human. Reaching out to the right, we have branch 1, causation. We've noted that it requires 2 steps. Step 1 is actual cause, which is the but-for or substantial factor test. Step 2 is proximate cause, which asks if the result was foreseeable without freak intervening events.
Beautiful. And with causation established, we need to know exactly what specific crime the defendant has committed. So it's time to draw the largest, thickest branch on our mind map. Imagine drawing a heavy line straight up from the center circle toward the top of the whiteboard. Label this grand branch murder.
Murder. This is the heavy hitter. According to the source text, the traditional common law defines murder as an unlawful killing committed with malice aforethought. And I just have to be honest, malice aforethought is a terrible phrase.
It really is.
It sounds like dialogue from a Shakespearean tragedy. It does not sound like something that belongs in a modern legal analysis.
It is a notoriously misleading, archaic phrase. It causes endless confusion for law students, and especially for ESL speakers. If we try to translate malice aforethought using common sense, we might assume malice means you felt deep anger, hatred, or wickedness toward the victim. And aforethought literally sounds like you thought about it before you did it, that you planned the killing in advance.
So common sense tells us it means, I hated you and I planned to kill you.
And legally, common sense is completely wrong here.
Seriously.
You do not need to feel any anger or hatred to possess legal malice, and you absolutely do not need to plan the killing in advance to possess legal aforethought. In the realm of criminal law, malice aforethought is no longer a descriptive phrase. It is simply a label on a bucket. Inside this bucket are 4 very specific, distinct mental states.
I find it really helpful to visualize these four mental states as the four faces of malice. If a prosecutor can prove that you were wearing just one of these four faces at the exact moment you caused the death, then you legally possess malice aforethought, and you are guilty of common law murder. We need to explore these faces one by one. What does the first face of malice look like?
The first face is the most intuitive. It is the intent to kill. You pointed a weapon at someone, you pulled the trigger or swung the blade, and your specific, conscious desire was to end their life.
This one is pretty easy to grasp, but the source material provides a very practical tip for how this is proven in an exam fact pattern. The text states that a jury is legally permitted to infer an intent to kill if the defendant uses a deadly weapon.
This is a crucial shortcut for the prosecution. Proving what is happening inside someone's head is difficult, but actions speak for themselves. If you hit someone with a feather pillow, it is nearly impossible for a prosecutor to argue you intended to kill them.
Obvious.
But if you swing a heavy steel machete at someone's neck, the deadly nature of the weapon itself provides the evidence of your mental state. The law allows the jury to assume you intended the natural consequences of using a lethal tool.
That makes perfect sense. Now, let's examine the second phase of malice. This one introduces a significant legal leap. The second phase is the intent to do serious bodily injury.
This mental state is fascinating because it acknowledges that the defendant did not actually want the victim to die.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The defendant's only goal was to inflict severe, grievous physical pain or permanent damage. But despite their intentions, the victim's body fails and they pass away.
The source material provides a brutal but clarifying example. The baseball bat scenario. Let's visualize Defendant A getting into a bitter dispute with Victim B. Defendant A decides to teach B a lesson. He picks up a heavy, solid wood baseball bat. He swings it with all his strength, aiming for B's knees or torso, thinking, I am going to shatter his bones and put him in a hospital bed for 6 months, but I definitely do not want a murder charge, so I won't aim for anything vital.
A terrible plan.
Right. However, the victim ducks, the bat strikes his skull, and he suffers a massive, fatal fracture. He dies instantly. Defendant A drops a bat, falls to his knees in tears, and screams, I swear I didn't mean to kill him. It was a terrible accident.
The defendant's tears and truthful protests do not change the legal outcome at all. The defendant possessed the intent to inflict serious, grievous bodily harm. He was wearing the second face of malice.
Just by swinging the bat.
Exactly. The legal philosophy here is that if you intentionally unleash that level of extreme violence against another human being, you are voluntarily accepting the risk that human bodies are fragile and the situation might escalate to a fatality. When that fatal risk becomes reality, the law automatically upgrades your bad intent to murder. Your intention to cause severe injury substitutes for the intent to kill.
So phase 1 is the intent to kill. Phase 2 is the intent to hurt someone incredibly badly, resulting in an unintended death. Now we arrive at the third phase of malice, which uses perhaps the most dramatic terminology in all of criminal law, depraved heart murder.
Depraved heart.
For our listener, depraved generally means morally corrupt, wicked, or completely devoid of basic human decency. But what does depraved heart mean in a courtroom?
Legally, a depraved heart refers to a mental state where the defendant acts with a reckless indifference to an unjustifiably high risk to human life. Let me translate that into simpler English. You engaged in an activity that was so incredibly dangerous, and you cared so little about whether innocent people lived or died, that the law will treat you exactly the same as a cold-blooded assassin.
You didn't target a specific victim. You didn't have the intent to kill anyone. You didn't even have the intent to cause an injury. You simply possessed a complete and total absence of care for the value of human life. The text uses an unforgettable example to illustrate this concept. The bowling ball.
It is the perfect illustration. Visualize a person standing on an overpass bridge, looking down at a busy, fast-moving interstate highway. Just for a thrill, or to see what kind of damage they can cause, they pick up a heavy, solid 15-pound bowling ball and drop it over the edge into the traffic below.
That's horrifying.
The ball crashes through the windshield of a passing minivan, striking and killing the driver instantly.
The person on the bridge didn't know the driver. They couldn't even see who was in the car. They had no specific intent to kill that particular person. But the act of dropping a massive, heavy object into high-speed traffic demonstrates a depraved heart. It screams to the world, I know this might kill someone and I completely do not care. Therefore, it is murder.
Precisely. However, we must be incredibly careful here. The MBE writers know that the line between normal bad behavior and depraved heart bad behavior is really thin, and they love to test that boundary. They almost always do this by using scenarios involving reckless driving.
That raises a really common scenario, actually. What if a person is just a terrible, aggressive driver? They're speeding to get to work, they're distracted by their phone, they decide to run a red light to save time, and they tragically T-bone another car, causing a fatal crash. They were undeniably reckless, they caused a death. Are they guilty of depraved heart murder?
No, they are not, and this distinction is vital. The source material emphasizes that ordinary reckless driving, even when it results in a horrific tragedy, does not rise to the level of depraved heart murder. It might qualify as manslaughter, which we will analyze on a different branch of our map, but it is not murder. For reckless driving to transform into depraved heart murder, the danger must be extreme and obvious.
Extreme. How does the law define extreme? Where is the line?
The text provides real-world court cases to help us draw that line. In one cited case, the driver was heavily intoxicated and driving at a massive, grossly excessive speed through a populated area. In another specific case from Arizona, a heavily intoxicated defendant was driving almost 70 miles per hour on a treacherous, curvy road where the posted speed limit was only 40.
So it's not just about making a bad, careless mistake behind the wheel. It is about actively creating a scenario that is practically guaranteed to result in a fatality, recognizing that immense risk, and choosing to press the gas pedal anyway. It is driving your car as if it were a bowling ball being dropped off a bridge.
That is the exact distinction. The risk must be unjustifiably high, and the disregard for that risk must be conscious and extreme.
We have covered three phases of malice: intent to kill, intent to cause serious injury, and depraved heart. This brings us to the fourth and final phase of malice. And this concept is so massive, so complex, and so frequently tested that we can't just list it. We need to give it its own entirely separate branch on our mind map.
I agree completely. Let's draw another thick, prominent branch extending from the center circle, perhaps pointing out to the left side of the whiteboard. Label this new branch felony murder.
Felony murder. This is a concept that often feels deeply unfair to people encountering it for the first time. What is the foundational rule here?
The foundational rule states that felony murder is an unintended killing that is proximately caused by and occurs during the commission or attempted commission of an inherently dangerous felony.
Let me break that down to make sure the mechanics are clear. You, the defendant, make a conscious decision to commit a dangerous crime like a robbery. You do not bring a weapon, and you absolutely do not plan to hurt anyone. You just want the money. But the situation spirals out of control, an accident happens, a victim falls and hits their head, and they die. Suddenly, the law ignores your lack of intent. You are no longer just a thief. You are a murderer facing a life sentence.
That is exactly how it works. We need to understand the legal philosophy behind this severe rule. The driving force is deterrence. The state wants to create an overwhelming disincentive to prevent people from committing inherently dangerous felonies. To achieve this, the law creates a strict liability trap. It says to the criminal, if you make the choice to initiate a dangerous felony, you are strictly legally responsible for any and all deaths that occur as a result of that choice, regardless of your intent.
The risk of a murder charge is supposed to scare people out of committing the robbery in the first place. But the rule specifies it must be an inherently dangerous felony. If I commit the felony of elaborate white-collar tax fraud, and the government auditor gets so stressed looking at my fake spreadsheets that they suffer a fatal heart attack, that is not felony murder, right?
Correct. Tax fraud is not inherently dangerous to human physical safety. The traditional common law recognizes a very specific list of felonies that carry this extreme strict liability. To help test takers instantly recall this list under exam pressure, our source text provides a brilliant mnemonic device, a memory trick.
Mnemonics are a lifesaver on the MBE. You need to be able to pull a list out of your brain in 3 seconds. What is the trick for the dangerous felonies?
The first letters of these inherently dangerous felonies spell the sound that a dog makes. B-A-R-R-K, B-A-R-R-K.
Let's spell that out clearly and write it directly on our felony murder branch. The letter B stands for burglary. The letter A stands for arson. The first letter R stands for rape. The second letter R stands for robbery. And the letter K stands for kidnapping.
B-A-R-R-J. The rule of thumb for the exam is simple. If you read a fact pattern and you see a defendant committing one of those 5 specific crimes and a dead body suddenly appears in the scenario, your brain should immediately flash a bright neon sign that reads felony murder.
I think we should explore why the law selected these specific 5 crimes. Why is burglary on the list?
Remember that the common law definition of burglary involves breaking and entering the dwelling of another person at night with the intent to commit a felony. The law recognizes that breaking into a dark house where people are sleeping creates a massive, explosive risk of a panicked, violent confrontation between the intruder and a terrified homeowner. It is inherently dangerous.
And arson is the malicious burning of a dwelling. Fire is wild, unpredictable, and easily traps people inside, making it lethal by its very nature. The other three, rape, robbery, and kidnapping, all involve the physical subjugation of a victim through violence or the immediate threat of violence. The danger to human life in those scenarios is obvious.
Exactly. Let's look at a simple mechanical example. Defendant X decides to commit a burglary, the B, in BARRK. He breaks the lock on a back door to steal electronics. He does not know the homeowner is awake. The homeowner startles X in the dark hallway. X panics, stumbles backward, and accidentally knocks over a heavy bookshelf, which crushes the homeowner, causing a fatal injury. X had zero intent to kill. He didn't even use a weapon. But because the death occurred during the commission of a burglary, that clumsy accident transforms into a charge of felony murder.
The intent to commit the burglary legally substitutes for the intent to kill. Now, the MBE rarely leaves things that simple. There are several complicated rules surrounding felony murder that examiners use to build complex questions. The first one highlighted in the text is the merger rule. This relates to the constitutional protection against double jeopardy, which prevents a person from being punished twice for the exact same conduct.
The merger rule is a critical limitation. Let's say a defendant walks into a bank with a shotgun and demands cash. That is robbery, an R in BAR. During the robbery, the defendant deliberately shoots and kills the bank teller. The prosecutor is thrilled and charges the defendant with two massive crimes: the underlying felony of robbery and felony murder based on that robbery. The question is, can the judge sentence the defendant to prison for both crimes simultaneously?
Our source text indicates that generally the answer is no. The underlying felony, the robbery, merges into the larger crime of felony murder.
A helpful way to visualize this is to imagine the felony murder charge as a massive predatory fish. The underlying robbery is a smaller fish. The big fish entirely swallows the small fish. The robbery becomes what is known as a lesser included offense. You can only be punished for the big fish. Now, a minority of modern states have passed specific statutes that explicitly allow a prosecutor to punish a defendant for both. But on the MBE, the default common law rule is merger. You only serve time for the murder.
Big fish swallows the small fish. That is a great image. Now let's tackle a question of timing. How long does the felony actually last? If I commit a robbery at a jewelry store, sprint out the door, jump into my getaway car, and while frantically driving away, I accidentally run over a pedestrian 3 blocks down the street, is the robbery still technically happening? Is that pedestrian's death felony murder?
The legal boundary for this is defined by the phrase, a place of temporary safety. The rule states that the felony continues, and the strict liability of the felony murder rule applies until the criminal has successfully fled and reached a place of temporary safety.
How does a jury determine what constitutes a place of temporary safety in real life?
It is a factual determination about the ongoing chain of events. If the criminal is still actively fleeing the scene, if they are engaged in a high-speed chase with the police, or if they are still fueled by the immediate adrenaline of the escape, the felony is still legally in progress. So, hitting that pedestrian 3 blocks away while checking the rearview mirror for sirens is absolutely felony murder.
But what if I am a very successful bank robber? What if I elude the police entirely, drive to my secret underground hideout, lock the door, count the money, sit down on the couch, and drink a beer while watching the news for an hour?
Right.
I feel completely secure.
In that scenario, you have successfully severed the chain. You have reached a place of temporary safety. The felony of robbery is legally concluded. If, after that hour of relaxation, you decide to leave the hideout to go buy a celebratory pizza and you accidentally run over a pedestrian on the way to the pizzeria, that death is no longer felony murder. The strict liability period ended when you sat on the couch. You might face vehicular manslaughter for the accident, but you escaped the felony murder charge because the robbery was over.
The chase must be over to cut off the liability. That makes the timeline very clear. Now, I need to take a deep breath because we have to talk about the most convoluted, highly tested, and confusing part of felony murder. This is the area that ties law students in knots. Scenarios involving bystanders, police shootouts, and something called the red line doctrine.
These fact patterns are intentionally chaotic. Let's build a classic MBE scenario step by step. Imagine you and your best friend decide to rob a convenience store. You both walk in armed with handguns. This is robbery, one of our BRI felonies. The store owner sees the guns, ducks behind the counter, pulls out his own legally registered shotgun, and opens fire to stop the robbery.
The store erupts into chaos. Bullets are flying in every direction.
We need to analyze two different outcomes from this chaos. Scenario A. The store owner fires his shotgun at you, but his aim is terrible. The blast misses you entirely and tragically strikes an innocent customer who was buying milk in the corner. The innocent customer dies. Are you, the armed robber who never fired a single shot, guilty of felony murder for the death of that customer?
My instinct is to say no, because I didn't pull the trigger that killed them. The store owner's bullet caused the death.
Your instinct aligns with one legal theory, but the law is split on this issue across different states. It depends entirely on which legal theory the jurisdiction applies. The first theory is called the agency theory. Under this strict approach, you are only legally responsible for killings committed by your agents, meaning yourself or your co-felons. Since the store owner is fighting against you, he is definitely not your agent. Under the agency theory, you are not responsible for the customer's death.
That seems like a clean, logical rule.
Yeah.
But there is a competing theory, isn't there?
Yes. The competing approach is the proximate cause theory. Under this much broader theory, the law takes a step back and looks at the big picture. The law says, you made the conscious choice to walk into a public store with loaded guns and initiate a violent robbery. It is entirely foreseeable that an armed citizen or a police officer would try to stop you, and it is highly foreseeable that an innocent person might get caught in the resulting crossfire. Because you set the dangerous dominoes in motion, the proximate cause theory holds you guilty of felony murder, even though the store owner pulled the fatal trigger.
So, if the victim is an innocent bystander, the answer on the exam will depend on whether the question specifies the agency theory or the proximate cause theory. But let's look at scenario B. This is the one the examiners love the most.
Scenario B. You and your friend are robbing the store. The store owner fires his shotgun and he hits your friend, the co-felon. Your friend dies instantly on the floor of the store. You are arrested. Can the prosecutor charge you with the felony murder of your own partner in crime?
Let me try to apply the theories. Under the agency theory, the answer is no, because the owner isn't my agent. But if the jurisdiction uses the broad proximate cause theory, the answer should be yes. I started the violent robbery. It is completely foreseeable that my partner could get shot during an armed heist. I set the dominoes in motion, so I should be on the hook for his murder, right?
That is the logical conclusion, but in the realm of the law, the answer is almost universally no. You're generally not guilty of felony murder when your co-felon is killed by a victim or by a police officer, regardless of which theory the state uses. This universal exception is formally known as the red line doctrine.
Okay, I need to stop you there, because that feels contradictory. If we're using the proximate cause theory, which blames me for starting the danger, why does the law suddenly give me a free pass for the death of my partner? I brought him into danger.
It feels contradictory until you examine the competing philosophical goals of the legal system. Yes, the state wants to punish you for the robbery, but the state also wants to strongly encourage and protect people like the heroic store owner or arriving police officers who use necessary deadly force to stop violent felonies in progress. The law formally classifies the store owner's action of shooting the armed robber as justifiable homicide. It was a lawful, legally protected act.
I understand that part. The owner's shot was legal and justified.
And here is the core foundational logic of the red line doctrine. You cannot build a criminal felony murder charge upon a foundation that the law considers perfectly legal and justifiable. The structural integrity of a murder charge requires an unlawful killing at its core. Because the store owner's shot was legally justified, the entire foundation for a felony murder charge simply does not exist for that specific death.
That is a brilliant piece of legal architecture. The foundation must be unlawful. Because the bullet that killed the co-felon was a legal bullet, the felony murder mechanism cannot engage. So the simple rule to memorize for the MBE is, if a good guy lawfully kills a bad guy, the surviving bad guy cannot be charged with felony murder for his partner's death.
That is the red line doctrine distilled to its essence.
Let's take a step back and survey our mental whiteboard to ensure we haven't lost the structure. In the center, we have the homicide circle. Reaching out to the right is the causation branch, with actual and proximate cause. Pointing straight up is the massive common law murder branch, detailing the 4 faces of malice. And pointing out to the left is our dedicated felony murder branch, featuring the BARK mnemonic and the intricacies of the red line doctrine.
All of those branches cover the traditional, historical common law. But society did not stop evolving in the 17th century. Modern governments, realizing the flaws of the old system, have written modern rules. So we need to add a new branch to our map. Let's draw a thick line pointing straight down toward the bottom of the whiteboard. Label this branch statutory crimes.
Statutory crimes.
Yeah.
This means laws that were debated, voted on, and written down in a book by a modern legislature. What was wrong with the common law of murder that prompted modern legislatures to rewrite the rules?
The old common law was an incredibly blunt instrument. It had only one bucket for murder. If a prosecutor proved you had any one of the four faces of malice aforethought, you were convicted of murder, and in historical times you frequently faced the mandatory death penalty. But as society evolved, it recognized a moral reality. Not all murders are equally evil.
There's a spectrum of culpability.
Exactly. A cold, calculating assassin who spends weeks mapping out a sniper attack is morally different from a reckless teenager who drops a bowling ball off a bridge for a joke. And that teenager is morally different from a person who gets into a drunken bar fight that unexpectedly turns fatal. The old law treated them all the same. Modern society needed a system of degrees to ensure the severity of the punishment actually fit the specific nature of the crime.
To achieve that, modern statutes generally divide the crime of murder into two distinct levels: first-degree murder and second-degree murder. Let's focus on the top tier. What specific elements must a prosecutor prove to elevate a homicide to first-degree murder?
The defining phrase for first-degree murder is deliberate and premeditated. This classification turns murder into what is known as a specific intent crime. It is not enough that you intended to kill in a sudden flash of anger. The state must prove that you consciously reflected on the idea of killing, you formulated a plan or made a clear decision, and then you executed that plan.
Premeditation. This single word creates a massive psychological trap for students taking the MBE. When the average person hears premeditation, they picture a Hollywood thriller. They imagine a villain sitting in a dark, smoke-filled room with a corkboard, connecting photographs with red string, and spending 6 months planning the perfect, untraceable crime.
That is cinematic premeditation. Legal premeditation operates on a vastly accelerated timeline. Our source material provides a stark clarification. The amount of time needed for premeditation may be brief. It must simply be long enough for the defendant to have considered the killing.
It just requires a moment of reflection. How long is that moment in the real world of a courtroom? A day?
An hour.
It can literally be measured in seconds. Imagine a heated argument escalating in an alleyway. Defendant A pulls out a loaded gun and points it at victim B. Defendant A pauses. In his mind, he thinks, he disrespected me. Should I pull this trigger? Yes, I'm going to end his life right now. And then he squeezes the trigger. That brief pause, that fleeting moment of conscious decision-making provides sufficient time for legal premeditation. Seconds. That is terrifyingly brief. I find it helpful to use an analogy about ordering food at a restaurant to separate first and second degree. First-degree murder is like sitting down, opening the menu, reading the descriptions, weighing your options, and finally deciding, I want the steak. You deliberately made a choice.
And second-degree murder, extending your analogy, is like walking into the restaurant feeling absolutely starving and just grabbing a steak off a passing waiter's tray and biting into it on pure impulse.
Whoa.
You still intended to eat the steak, you performed the act with intent, but you did not engage in a process of deliberation or decision-making. You acted on a sudden, unreflective urge.
That perfectly sets up our definition for second-degree murder. If first degree requires the pause to look at the menu and plan, what falls into the category of second degree?
Second-degree murder operates as the great statutory catch-all. If a prosecutor can successfully prove that you possessed one of the four faces of malice, perhaps you intended to kill on a sudden impulse, or you intended to cause serious bodily injury, or you acted with a depraved heart but the prosecutor cannot prove that you took the time to premeditate or deliberate, then the crime defaults into the bucket of second-degree murder.
It captures all the malicious, terrible killings that simply lack the cold calculation of a plan.
Exactly. Before we leave the statutory branch, I must note two other categories of crime that modern statutes automatically elevate to first-degree murder, entirely bypassing the need to prove premeditation. The first category involves our old friends from the BARRK mnemonic. A homicide committed during the course of a burglary, arson, rape, robbery, or kidnapping is so inherently dangerous that modern statutes frequently classify it automatically as first-degree felony murder.
The legislature basically says, if you commit one of these 5 worst of the worst felonies, we aren't going to debate how much you planned the resulting death. We are just going to fast-track you to the maximum possible punishment.
That is the legislative intent. The second category involves heinous murders. These are methods of killing that are so objectively cruel, terrifying, or cowardly that the law declares them automatically first degree. The source text lists specific examples: ambush, which is hiding and lying in wait for an unsuspecting victim; torture; bombings; acts of terrorism; or poisoning.
Poisoning is an excellent logical example. It is practically impossible to accidentally slip a lethal dose of arsenic into someone's tea in a sudden, unplanned heat of the moment. The act of acquiring and administering poison inherently requires thought, planning, and cold calculation.
Oh.
So on our mind map, under the statutory branch pointing down, we should mentally write: plan heinous, BAR arc, first degree, and below that, unplanned malice, second degree.
Which brings us to a profound and challenging question about human nature and the law. What happens if someone intentionally kills another person? They absolutely meant to pull the trigger, but they had an incredibly compelling, deeply human reason to lose their temper and completely snap. Should a person who acts in a moment of overwhelming emotional devastation be treated the same as a cold-blooded contract killer?
That philosophical question opens the door to the final major branch on our mind map. Imagine drawing a thick line extending down into the right from the center circle. Write the word manslaughter.
Manslaughter is the area of criminal law that attempts to accommodate human frailty. It is a legal acknowledgement that under extreme, agonizing circumstances, even normally rational people can be pushed beyond their emotional breaking point and make terrible, irreversible mistakes.
The source material divides the manslaughter branch into two distinct sub-branches: voluntary and involuntary. Let's tackle voluntary manslaughter first. The word voluntary implies that the defendant wanted to perform the action.
They absolutely did. Voluntary manslaughter involves a fully intentional killing. The defendant possessed the malice aforethought; they intended to kill or cause serious injury. However, the law steps in and says, we recognize the unique circumstances here and we are going to mitigate this charge. Mitigate simply means to reduce the severity of the punishment. The law reduces the crime from murder down to voluntary manslaughter because the defendant acted in what is called the heat of passion.
Heat of passion sounds like the title of a dramatic romance novel. What are the mechanical requirements for proving it in a sterile courtroom?
The legal requirement is that the defendant must have been triggered by adequate provocation. This cannot be just a minor annoyance. The provocation must be a situation so extreme, so shocking, that it would cause a normal, reasonable, average person in society to completely lose their mind and act out of pure, blinding emotion rather than rational thought.
The source text gives us a few concrete examples of what constitutes adequate provocation. Being the victim of a severe physical battery or an agonizing assault can trigger it. Facing a sudden, terrifying threat of deadly force can trigger it. And the most famous classic common law example: unexpectedly walking into your own bedroom and discovering your spouse in the act of committing adultery.
Those are scenarios where the law begrudgingly admits we cannot condone the violence, but we understand that a normal human being might suffer a total psychological break in that exact moment. But here's where we must introduce a massive MBE exam note. You should visualize this rule highlighted in glowing neon yellow on your mental map.
What is the trap?
The rule is absolute. Mere words are never enough to constitute adequate provocation.
I have to challenge that, because words can be devastating. What if a sworn enemy approaches me in public and says the most horrific, deeply personal, cruel things imaginable? What if they verbally desecrate the memory of my deceased parents and describe horrible things they want to do to my children? The emotional pain from those words could easily match the pain of a physical punch.
The emotional pain might be immense, but the legal rule is rigid and unyielding. The law demands that a reasonable person must possess the emotional fortitude to hear terrible, offensive words and not resort to lethal violence. Taunts, insults, shouting, racial slurs, or cruel revelations, no matter how deeply they cut, will never legally reduce a murder charge to voluntary manslaughter. If you kill someone over an insult, you will be convicted of murder. Adequate provocation requires a physical threat, a physical battery, or a visually shocking discovery like the adultery scenario.
Okay, the rule is clear. Words are legally harmless. Let's build a scenario where we do have adequate provocation. I walk into my house and discover the classic adultery scenario. I am instantly filled with the blinding heat of passion. But instead of grabbing a weapon in that exact second, I turn around and run out of the house. I walk down to a local park. I sit on a bench for 4 hours, staring at the trees, absolutely seething with rage, playing the betrayal over and over in my head. Finally, after 4 hours, I stand up, walk back to the house, and kill the person. Is my crime still mitigated down to manslaughter?
No, it is not. Your crime has escalated back up to murder. And the mechanism responsible for that escalation is called the cooling off rule.
The cooling off rule. This introduces a timeline into the emotional state.
It introduces a strictly objective timeline. The law asks the jury to evaluate the gap of time between the shocking provocation and the actual killing. The question is, was there sufficient time during that gap for a reasonable average person to cool off, process their emotions, and regain their rational senses? If the jury determines that a reasonable person would have calmed down, then the legal mitigation of heat of passion simply vanishes. Your crime jumps right back up to murder.
But wait, what if I argue about my specific, subjective mental state? I can honestly tell the jury, I am a person who holds deep grudges. I have a terrible temper. During those 4 hours on the park bench, I didn't cool off at all. My blood was boiling just as hot in hour 4 as it was in the first 10 seconds.
The law's response to your subjective reality is cold and uncompromising. The law does not care about your personal emotional timeline. The standard for mitigation is based on a hypothetical, reasonable person, not on your personal inability to regulate your anger. If a reasonable person would have calmed down after a 4-hour walk in the park, then the legal excuse is gone. You are judged by the standard of society, not by the standard of your own flaws.
That is a brutal reality check, but it enforces public safety. The law refuses to reward defendants simply for possessing a terrible, enduring temper. Now, the text mentions one more pathway to arrive at a voluntary manslaughter conviction, and it refers to it as an imperfect defense. How does that operate?
The imperfect defense typically arises in scenarios involving self-defense. Let's imagine a situation where someone attacks you on the street and you shoot them. If the jury determines you used a reasonable amount of force to protect yourself from imminent death, the homicide is fully justified. You commit no crime. But what if the scenario is messy? What if you were the one who verbally started the confrontation? Or what if someone punches you in the face and in a state of absolute panic, you unreasonably convince yourself they are reaching for a gun, so you shoot them?
In that panic scenario, I genuinely believed I needed to use deadly force to survive. My subjective belief was completely true inside my own head. But anyone watching a security tape of the fight would say that was completely unreasonable. The guy was just throwing a punch.
Exactly. Because your belief was objectively unreasonable, the law says you do not deserve a full, not guilty self-defense verdict. You made a terrible mistake in judgment. But because you truly subjectively believed you were fighting for your life, the law feels that branding you a cold-blooded murderer is too harsh. So, in many jurisdictions, they utilize this imperfect defense doctrine to land on a compromise verdict right in the middle: voluntary manslaughter.
It acknowledges the intent to kill, but mitigates it due to the presence of genuine, albeit foolish, fear. Okay, that comprehensively covers the voluntary side of the manslaughter branch. Let's shift our focus to the other side: involuntary manslaughter. The word involuntary means the death was an unintended accident.
Yes, involuntary manslaughter involves an unintentional homicide where you absolutely did not want anyone to die, but your conduct represented a severe criminal failure of responsibility.
The source materials divide involuntary manslaughter into two distinct categories. The first is criminal negligence. Now, I need to pause and challenge this terminology because I am putting myself in the shoes of an ESL test taker, and this feels like a linguistic trap. Earlier on the murder branch, we discussed depraved heart murder, which involved extreme recklessness like dropping a bowling ball off a bridge. Now, on the manslaughter branch, we have criminal negligence, which also involves being careless or reckless. How on earth is a student supposed to tell these two concepts apart in a dense fact pattern? They sound identical.
It is arguably one of the most difficult, nuanced distinctions to make on the entire exam. The key to differentiating them is to imagine a spectrum of bad behavior and conscious awareness. Depraved heart murder sits at the absolute extreme top of the recklessness scale. It requires conscious disregard. It means the defendant actually realized, in their own mind, that there is a massive lethal risk, and they consciously decided, I don't care, I'm doing it anyway. The teenager on the bridge knew dropping the bowling ball could kill a driver, and dropped it regardless.
Okay, so depraved heart requires a conscious, wicked disregard of an obvious lethal risk. Where does criminal negligence sit on that spectrum?
Criminal negligence sits lower on the spectrum. It typically involves a situation where the defendant failed to perceive or realize a risk that a normal, reasonable person absolutely would have realized. The defendant wasn't acting with conscious malice or wicked disregard. They were just being terribly, tragically oblivious or careless.
Can you illustrate that failure to perceive with a concrete example?
The source text provides a scenario that is heartbreaking, but legally very clear. Imagine a parent who fails to take their severely ill minor child to the doctor. The parent might honestly, but foolishly, convince themselves that the child just has a stubborn cold. The parent loves the child. They are not trying to hurt them. They are not conscientiously ignoring a known risk of death. Their brain has simply misjudged the reality of the illness. But any reasonable, average parent looking at the child's symptoms would have instantly recognized the severe danger and sought emergency medical help.
Because the parent grossly failed to exercise the standard of care that society expects, and that failure resulted in death, they face a criminal charge. Another example might be a landlord who fails to perform routine maintenance on a gas heater, and a tenant tragically dies of carbon monoxide poisoning. The landlord didn't want the tenant to die. They didn't consciously create a lethal trap. They were just grossly, fatally careless about their responsibilities.
Those are perfect illustrations. Criminal negligence is about a gross, unacceptable deviation from how a normal, careful person would act, but it lacks that wicked, depraved, conscious disregard for human life that elevates a crime to murder.
That spectrum makes the distinction much clearer. Depraved heart equals, I know this might kill someone and I completely do not care. Criminal negligence equals, I should have known this was incredibly dangerous, but I was tragically careless. Now we arrive at the final category under involuntary manslaughter, the unlawful actor doctrine. The text sometimes refers to this as the misdemeanor manslaughter rule.
It functions very much like a miniature version of the felony murder rule, but it applies to smaller crimes.
The rule is that you accidentally cause a death while committing a minor crime, a misdemeanor. But to understand how this rule actually works, the source text introduces us to two more Latin phrases. For an ESL speaker, Latin is just a second layer of translation to deal with. We need to break these down into simple, memorable English. The phrases are malum in se and malum prohibitum. Let's unpack the first one. What does malum in se actually mean?
Malum in se translates literally to wrong in itself. It describes an act that is inherently evil, immoral, or dangerous by its very nature, regardless of whether a legislature ever bothered to write a law against it.
A perfect example would be punching a stranger in the face. Even if you lived in a society with absolutely no written law books, randomly assaulting someone is just universally recognized as a wrong, bad thing to do.
Exactly. Crimes like simple assault and battery are considered malum in se. The legal rule states that if you commit a malum in se misdemeanor, for instance, you get angry and punch someone in a bar fight, and that person unexpectedly loses their balance, falls backwards, strikes their head on the edge of a table, and dies, that accidental death is involuntary manslaughter. Because the underlying act of punching them was inherently wrong and dangerous, the law holds you fully responsible for the tragic, unintended consequence.
The inherent wrongness of the act carries the liability forward. Now contrast that with the second Latin phrase. What does malum prohibitum mean?
Malum prohibitum translates to wrong merely because it is prohibited. These are actions that are not inherently evil or immoral. They are simply regulatory rules created by society to keep things organized and running smoothly.
Regulatory rules, like parking your car in a red zone or failing to renew your vehicle registration. There's nothing inherently evil about a piece of paper in your glove box being one day past its expiration date. It is just a bureaucratic rule.
Precisely. And the legal treatment for these crimes is entirely different. The rule is, if an accidental death results while you are committing a malum prohibitum crime, it is generally not considered involuntary manslaughter unless the act itself was also committed in a criminally negligent manner.
Let me test this with a scenario. I am driving down the street. I am completely sober. I am obeying the speed limit. I have my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. I am driving perfectly safely. However, my driver's license expired 3 days ago, which means I am technically committing a misdemeanor by driving. Suddenly, a pedestrian wearing dark clothes jumps out from behind a parked van directly into the path of my car. I slam on the brakes, but I hit and kill them. The prosecutor looks at the police report and says, you were committing a misdemeanor by driving without a valid license when the death occurred. Therefore, under the unlawful actrin, you were guilty of involuntary manslaughter.
The prosecutor's argument would fail completely. The expired piece of plastic in your wallet was not the cause of the death. It was merely a paperwork violation, a malum prohibitum offense. Because you were driving safely, there was no criminal negligence. The death was an unavoidable accident, and the expired license does not magically transform that accident into a homicide.
But if we tweak the facts, if I'm driving without a license and I am speeding at 60 miles per hour through an active school zone while texting on my phone, then I have crossed the line.
Yes, in that tweaked scenario, your driving has become criminally negligent. The prosecutor wouldn't even need to rely on the expired license. Your grossly careless behavior itself provides the basis for an involuntary manslaughter charge. The Latin distinction of malum in se versus malum prohibitum is simply a tool the law uses to separate true moral wrongdoing from simple administrative rule breaking.
Translating it as wrong in itself versus wrong by rule makes it a very practical tool for exam analysis. And with that final distinction, we have completely populated every branch of our mental mind map. We've covered the entire common law and statutory landscape of homicide.
It is a massive amount of information, but the visual structure makes it manageable.
Let's do a final comprehensive visual review of our whiteboard to lock it in. We started in the very center with the core definition, the homicide circle. The foundational rule inside that circle is that the victim must be a living human being at the time of the act. You cannot break a cup that is already shattered.
From there, we drew branch 1 extending to the right, causation. This branch requires a two-step analysis. Step 1 is actual cause, utilizing the but-for parallel universe test or the substantial factor test for simultaneous events. Step 2 is proximate cause, which asks the jury to watch the dominoes fall and determine if the final death was a foreseeable result, uncorrupted by bizarre, freak intervening acts like a lightning strike.
Then we drew branch 2, the thickest line, pointing straight up, murder. We translated the confusing, archaic phrase malice aforethought into the four phases of malice. Phase 1, intent to kill. Phase 2, intent to cause serious bodily injury, accepting the risk of death. Phase 3, depraved heart, demonstrating an extreme, wicked disregard for a massive risk to human life, like dropping a bowling ball into traffic.
And Phase 4 earned its own dedicated branch pointing to the left, felony murder. This is the strict liability trap designed for deterrence. We rely on the barking dog mnemonic BRR to remember the inherently dangerous felonies: burglary, arson, rape, robbery, and kidnapping. And we noted the critical red line doctrine, which protects a defendant from a murder charge if their co-felon is lawfully killed by a victim or police officer.
Then we recognized the evolution of law and drew branch 4 pointing straight down, statutory crimes. This represents the legislature stepping in to create degrees of punishment. First-degree murder requires the pause of premeditation and deliberation, looking at the menu before ordering. Second-degree murder serves as the default catch-all for malicious but unplanned killings.
Finally, we drew branch 5 pointing down and to the right, manslaughter. This branch accounts for human frailty. It splits into voluntary manslaughter, where the intense heat of passion mitigates an intentional killing, provided the defendant didn't have time to cool off, and involuntary manslaughter, capturing unintended deaths caused by criminal negligence or the commission of an inherently dangerous malum in se misdemeanor.
To our listener who is diligently preparing for the MBE, the language used by the bar examiners is deliberately designed to confuse you, to overwhelm you, and to make you second-guess your instincts. But the foundational concepts underlying those confusing words are solid and logical. If you can keep this simple translated mind map vibrant in your head, you are incredibly well equipped to dissect whatever chaotic fact pattern they throw onto your exam booklet.
You have the structural tools, you understand the why behind the rules, trust in your preparation, and rely on the logic.
Before we officially sign off, I know you always like to leave us with one final, slightly provocative thought, drawn from the deepest, dustiest corners of the source material. What historical nugget do you have for us today to wrap up this deep dive?
There is a fascinating, tiny rule buried near the end of the causation section in our source text. It is a relic known as the year and a day rule. Under the strict historical common law, if you maliciously shot someone and that victim clung to life in a hospital bed for exactly a year and 2 days before finally succumbing to the wound, you could not be charged with murder. The law created a conclusive presumption that you are not the legal cause of the death.
A year and 2 days. You shoot someone, they slowly die from the bullet wound you inflicted, and you completely escape a murder charge just because of how the calendar page is turned. Why would the legal system ever endorse such an arbitrary timeline?
It seems absurd today, but we have to view it through the lens of history. Hundreds of years ago, medical science was incredibly primitive. If a victim somehow managed to survive for a full year after suffering a grievous injury, the courts believed it was scientifically impossible to prove what ultimately killed them. Did they die from the original bullet wound? Or did they die from a secondary infection, a sudden fever, or perhaps just appallingly bad medical care by 17th century doctors? The chain of causation became simply too blurry and unreliable after a year had passed.
But the source text notes that the vast majority of modern states have completely abolished this rule.
And I want our listener to ponder exactly why that abolition happened, what changed in the world. Think about modern life support systems. Think about mechanical ventilators, intravenous feeding tubes, and highly advanced surgical interventions. Today, modern medical technology possesses the ability to keep a victim's physical body alive for years, sometimes even decades, after a catastrophic fatal blow. The old common law rule became entirely obsolete because human technology literally altered the natural timeline of death. It is a perfect, profound example of how the rigid rules of the law are constantly forced to evolve when the reality of the world around them changes.
That is a brilliant historical perspective. The law is not just a collection of dusty books. It is a living reflection of our current reality and capabilities. Which brings us right back full circle to the questions we asked at the very beginning. Why might shooting someone sometimes not be murder? Because reality dictates they were already dead. And why might dropping a bowling ball get you a murder charge? Because the law values human life so highly that it punishes extreme, wicked recklessness just as severely as it punishes a sniper's deliberate bullet. It's all fundamentally about how society values human life and the strict rules we invent to measure responsibility when that life is unlawfully taken away. Thank you so much for joining us on this exhaustive deep dive. Best of luck with your exam preparation and keep that mental map clear.